I'm going to read a couple of short things. One, I don't think of myself really as a poet, but I like the idea of writing poetry. And this is what I consider a prose poem. It may not be. But it was some random thoughts that I ended up putting together, and it's called Crazy. Critics have said that Shakespeare's Macbeth is a man who fell in love with his wife's madness. I have seen a crazy woman's hands kneading the air in her sleep, as if she were darning what was torn in her mind. There are so many wanderers, all pleasantness lost, claiming microchips have been installed in their heads, having hot arguments with enemies who are no longer present. "Who are you yelling at?" I yelled, and his insanity stared through me as if I wasn't there. I heard a Marine ask the girl, "Then why did you invite me here?" And she said, "Because I wanted you to beat me." Kierkegaard called Abraham a knight of faith because he was willing to give up everything, even his son, in obedience to the instructions he'd heard, confident he would get it all back. And there was a fascinating student who wanted me to read her fiction, but she handed me a scrapbook of stories written in Crayola and in glossy words razored from magazines and glued onto the page. She thought writing was a ransom note. The child was not returned. This is a found story. It's very short. My oldest sister had a husband who recently died of Alzheimer's, and all of this actually happened. The sleepwalker. She watches his slow decline as she would a fire at home on restful evenings, opera softly emanating from the stereo in another room, perhaps a glass of cool Pinot Noir at hand, and he patiently staring at nothing at all, lost in thoughtlessness, as silent as smoke, as the flames eat away at the charred wood, feasting on all the good of it. He was once so many people: a hardy farm boy, a wild seaman, a cook on a Portuguese fishing boat, a roughneck on oil wells, then an oil driller himself, an inventor, a father, the owner of restaurants and farmland and commercial properties, yet ever laughing and lovable and in awe of learning, and now unlearning more with each week. Reminded of his accomplishments, he smiled as he said, "I did that? Well, I'll be goddamned." And now he is a wanderer, bewildered by unfamiliar rooms, finding his way outdoors in raw weather without a coat, and needing neighbors to guide him back to an address he can't recall. And a toddler too, forgetting etiquette, getting into mischief, eating ice cream for breakfast with his 4-year-old granddaughter, who tells him he can, who gives him permission. The loneliness is the hardest part, the memories that she can no longer share with any meaning, or saying things of importance and realizing that they will not be recalled, and fearing the probable time to come when she will be feared, a wife to a man for whom husbanding has ended. She's becomingly, increasingly a stranger, invading his littler portion of certainty. Some nights she hears him walking from room to room as if hunting his history, his mind, the hurly-burly life he's lost. She aches to think what it must be like to be him, to be helpless, puzzled, surprised, infantile. Hundreds of faces without names, recognitions of him that he is not equal to. But he finds his wife sleeping on the frilly daybed in the feminine sunroom at the front of the house. And he looms over her like his old self. And in the sentience of that night, he says in his sudden and momentary wakefulness, "I know how hard all of this is for you, and I appreciate what you're doing." Then he retreats into the hallway and back into his illness. But those words stay with her and are enough. This is, I was telling Paul, this is an early story. It's called Nebraska. I was approached by the Prairie Schooner, which is a University of Nebraska publication, and they asked me if I had any stories about Nebraska. They knew I was from there. And I said, of course I do. And of course I didn't. But I always admired how poets can get away with changing subjects in the middle of a poem. And so I decided I was just going to put these random memories together and see if they worked out, and eventually they did. So this is Nebraska. The town is Americus, Covenant, Denmark, Grange, Hooray, Jerusalem, Sweetwater. One of the lesser-known moons of the Platte, conceived in sickness and misery by European pioneers who took the path of least resistance and put down roots in an emptiness like the one they kept secret in their youth. In Swedish and Danish and German and Polish, in anxiety and fury and God's providence, they chopped at the Great Plains with spades, creating green sod houses that crumbled and collapsed in the rain and disappeared in the first persuasive snow. Were so low, the grown-ups stooped to go inside, and yet were places of ownership and a hard kind of happiness, the places their occupants gravely stood before on those plenary occasions when photographs were taken. And then the Union Pacific stopped by, just a camp of white campaign tents and a boy playing his harpoon at night. And then a supply store, a depot, a pine water tank, stockyards, and the mean prosperity of the 20th century. The train strolling into town to shed a boxcar in the depot side yard, or crying past at 60 miles per hour, possibly interrupting a girl in her high wire act, her arms looping up when she tips to one side, the rail top as slippery as a silver spoon. And then the yellow and red locomotive rises up from the heat shimmer over a mile away, the August noonday warping the side of it, but cinders tapping away from the spikes and the iron rails already vibrating up inside the girl's shoes. She steps down to the roadbed and then into high wheeze as the Union Pacific pulls Wyoming coal and Georgia Pacific lumber and snowplow blades and slat Japanese pickup trucks through the open countryside and onto Omaha. And when it passes by, a worker she knows is opposite her, like a pedestrian at a stoplight, the sun not letting up, the plain song of grasshoppers going on and on between them until the worker says, hot. Twice the Union Pacific tracks cross over the sidewinding Democrat. The water slow as an ox cart, green as silage, croplands to the east, yards and houses to the west, a green ceiling of leaves in some places, whirlpools showing up in it like spinning plates that lose speed and disappear. In winter, in a week or more of just above zero, high school couples walk the gray ice, kicking up snow as quiet words are passed between them. Opinions are mildly compromised, sorrows are apportioned. And Emil Jedlicka unslings his blue stock 22 and slogs through high browns and brown weeds and snow, hunting ringneck pheasant, sidelong rabbits, and always suddenly quail, as his little brother Orrin sprints across the Democrat in order to slide like an otter. July in town is a gray highway and a Ford hay truck spraying by, the hay sailing like a yellow ribbon caught in the mouth of a prancing dog. And Billy Awalt up there on the camel's hump, 18 years old and sweaty and dirty, peppered and dappled with hay dust, a lump of chew like an extra thumb under his lower lip, his blue eyes happening on a Dairy Queen, and a pretty girl licking a pale trickle of ice cream from a cone. And Billy slaps his heart and cries, "Oh, I am pierced." And late October is orange on the ground and blue overhead, and grain silos stacked up like white poker chips. and a high silver water tower belittled one night by the slappy tattoo of 1 year's class at George W. Norris High. And below the silos and water tower are stripped treetops, their gray limbs lifted up in alleluia, their yellow leaves crowding along yard fences and sheeping along the sidewalks and alleys under the shepherding wind. Or January, and heavy snow partitioning the landscape, widening out the highways and woods and cattle lots until there are only open spaces and steamed-up window panes, and a Nordstrom boy limping pitifully in the hard plaster of his clothes, the snow as deep as his hips, when the boy tips over and cannot get up, until a little Schumacher girl sitting by the stoop window, a spoon in her mouth, a bowl of Cheerios in her lap, says in plain voice, "There's a boy," and her mother looks out to the sidewalk. Houses are big and white and 2 stories high, each a cousin to the next, with pigeon roosts in the attic gables, green storm windows on the upper floor, and a green-screened porch, some as pillowed and couched as parlors, or made into sleeping rooms for the boy whose next step will be the Navy and days spent on a ship with his hometown's own population, on gray water that rises up and is allayed, like a geography of cornfields, sugar beets, soybeans, wheat, that stays there and says in its own way, "Stay." Houses are turned away from the land and toward whatever is not always, sitting across from each other like dressed-up children at a party at daylight, their parents looking on with hopes and fond expectations. Overgrown elm and sycamore trees poach the sunlight from the lawns and keep petticoats of snow around them into April. In the deep lots out back are wire clotheslines with flapping white sheets pinned to them. Property lines are hedged with sour green and purple grapes, or with rabbit wire and gardens of peonies, roses, gladiola, irises, marigolds, pansies. Fruit trees are so closely planted that they cannot sway without knitting. The apples and cherries drop and sweetly decomposed until there are only slight brown bumps in the yard. But the pears stay up in the wind, drooping under the pecks of birds, withering down like peppers until their sorrow is justly noticed, and they one day disappear. Lying against an alley of blue shale rock is a garage whose doors slash weeds and scrape up pebbles as an old man pokily swings them open, teetering with his last weak push. And then Victor Johnson rummages inside, being cautious about his gray sweater and high-top shoes, looking over paint cans, junked electric motors, grass rakes and garden rakes, and a pitchfork and sickles, gray doors and ladders piled overhead in the rafters, and an old wind-up Victrola, and heavy platter records from the 20s, on one of them a soprano singing, "I'm a Lonesome Melody." Under a green tarpaulin is a wooden movie projector he painted silver, and big cans of tan celluloid, much of it orange and green with age, but one strip of it preserved, of an army pilot in Jodhpurs, hopping from one biplane onto another's upper wing. Country people who paid to see the movie had been spellbound by the slight dip of the wings at the pilot's jump, the slap of his leather jacket, and how his hair strayed wild and was promptly sleeked back by the wind. But looking at the strip now, pulling a ribbon of it to a window pane and letting it unspool to the ground, Victor can make out only 20 frames of the leap, and then snapshot after snapshot of an army pilot clinging to the biplane's wing. And yet Victor stays with it, as though that scene of one man staying alive were what he'd paid his nickel for. Main Street is just a block away. Pickup trucks stop in it so their drivers can angle out over their brown left arms and speak about crops or praise the weather or make up sentences whose only real point is their lack of complication. And then a cattle truck comes up and they mosey along with a touch of their cap bills or a slap of the door metal. High school girls in skin-tight jeans stay in one place on weekends, and jacked-up cars cruise past, rowdy farm boys overlapping inside, pulling over now and then in order to give the girls cigarettes and sips of pop and grief about their lipstick. And when the cars peel out, the girls say how a particular boy measured up, or they gossip about Donna Moriarty and the scope she permitted Randy when he came back from boot camp. Everyone is famous in this town, and everyone is necessary. Townspeople go to the Vaughan grocery store for the daily news and to the home restaurant for history class, especially at evensong when the old people eat graveled pot roast and lemon meringue pie and calmly sip coffee from cups they tip to their mouths with both hands. The Kiwanis Club meets here on Tuesday nights, and hopes are made public, petty sins are tidily dispatched. The proceeds from the gumball machines are tallied up and poured into the upkeep of a playground. Usler's Hardware has picnic items and kitchen appliances in its one window, in the manner of those prosperous men who'd prefer to be known for their hobbies. And there is one crisp white Protestant church with a steeple of the sort pictured on calendars, and the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church, grayly holding the town at bay like a Gothic wolfhound. And there's an insurance agency, a county coroner and justice of the peace, a second-hand shop, a handsome chiropractor named Cook who coaches the Pony League baseball team, a post office approached on unpainted wood steps outside of a cheap mobile home, the Nighthawk Tavern, where there's Falstaff tap beer, a green pool table, a poster recording the Cornhusker scores, a crazy man patiently tolerated, a gray-haired woman with an unmoored eye, a boy in spectacles thick as paperweights, a carpenter missing one index finger, a plump waitress whose day job is in a basement beauty shop, and an old woman who creeps up to the side door at 8 in order to purchase one shot glass of whiskey. And yet, passing by and paying attention, an outsider is only aware of what isn't, that there's no bookshop, no picture show, no pharmacy or dry cleaners, no cocktail parties, extreme opinions, jewelry or piano stores, motels, hotels, hospital, political headquarters, philosophical theories about being and the soul. High importance is only attached to practicalities, and so there is the bachelor funeral home, where a proud old gentleman is on display in a dark brown suit, his yellow fingernails finally clean, his smeared eyeglasses in his coat pocket, a grandchild on tiptoes by the casket, peering at the lips that will not move, the sparrow chest that will not rise. And there's Tommy Seymour's for Sinclair gasoline and mechanical repairs, a green balloon dinosaur bobbing from a string over the cash register, old tires piled beneath the cottonwood, for sale in the side yard, a Case tractor, a John Deere reaper, a hay mower, a red manure spreader, and a rusty crane conveyor. Green weeds overcoming them, standing up inside them, trying slyly and little by little to inherit machinery for the earth. And beyond that are woods, a slope of pasture, 6 empty cattle pens, a driveway made of limestone pebbles, and the house where Alice Sorensen pages through a child's World Book encyclopedia, stopping at the descriptions of California, Cape Town, Ceylon, Colorado, Copenhagen, Corpus Christi, Costa Rica, Cyprus. Widow Dworick has been watering the lawn in an open raincoat and apron, but at 9 she walks the green hose around to the spigot and screws down the nozzle so that the spray is a misty crystal ball, softly baptizing the ivy. She says, "How about some chamomile tea?" And she says, "Yum, oh boy, that hits the spot," and bends to shut the water off. The Union Pacific night train rolls through town just after 10 o'clock, when a 60-year-old man named Adolph Schooley is a boy again in bed, and when the huge weight of 40 or 50 cars jostles his upstairs room like a motor he'd put a quarter in. And over the sighing industry of the train, he can hear the train saying, "Nebraska, Nebraska, 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 and he cannot sleep. Mrs. Antoinette Heft is at the home restaurant, placing frozen meat patties on wax paper, pausing at times to clamp her fingers under her arms and press the sting from them. She stops when the Union Pacific passes, then picks a cigarette out of a pack of Cools and smokes it on the back porch, smelling air as crisp as oxidol, looking up at stars the Pawnee Indians looked at, hearing the low harmonica of big rigs on the highway, in the town she knows like the palm of her hand, in the country she knows by heart. My last story is another found story. It's actually one that was lived by my father-in-law and was hanging around the family for a number of years, and then I decided to write it down and kill it. This is called My Kid's Dog. My kid's dog died, Sparky. I hated that dog. The feeling was mutual. We got off on the wrong foot, whining in his pen those first nights, my squirt gun in his face and him blinking from the water, and then the holes in the yard, the so-called accidents in the house, his nose snuffling into my Brooks Brothers trousers, him slurping my fine Pilsner beer or sneaking bites of my Dagwood sandwich when I fell asleep on the sofa. Also, his inability to fetch, to take a joke, to find the humor in sudden air horns, to be dandled, roughhoused, or teased, and then the growling, the skulking, the snapping at my ankles, the hiding from me under the house, and literally thousands of abject refusals to obey, like, who the hell are you? You'd have thought he was a cat. When pushed to the brink, I shouted, I'll cut your face off and show it to you. And the small-brained mammal just stared at me. But with my kids or my wife, little Foo-Foo was a changeling, conning them with the tail, the prance, the peppiness, the soft chocolate eyes, the sloppy expressions of love, the easy tricks that if I'd perform, I'd get no credit for. Oh, we understood each other all right. I was on to him. And then at age 10, and none too soon, he kicked the bucket. You'd think that would be it, end of story. But no, he had to get even. Those who have tears prepare to shed them. I was futzing with the hinges on the front yard gate on a Saturday afternoon, my Tattersall shirt sleeves rolled up and my mind off in Oklahoma, when I noticed Fido in a California shade, snoozing, but for once a little wistful too, and far more serene than he usually was in my offensive presence. I tried to surprise him with my standard patriarchal shout, but it was no go. So I walked over and prodded the little guy with my wingtip. Nothing doing. And not so much as a flutter in his oddly abstracted face. Surely this was a big sleep, I thought. She who must be obeyed was at the mall provisioning, so I was safe from objection or inquiry on that account. I then made an inventory of my progeny, Buzz in the collegiate East in the realm of heart attack tuitions, Zach in the netherworld of the surf shop, Susie, my last kid, on her bike and somewhere with her cousin. Were I to bury Rover with due haste and dispatched, I could forestall the waterworks, even convince them that he's signed up with the circus, run afoul of Cruella de Vil, anything but died. I got a green tarpaulin from the garage and laid it out on the front yard. Why hesitated before using my shoe to roll Spot into his funeral shroud, then dragged him back into the Victory Garden where August's dying zucchini plants were in riot. With trusty spade, I dug his burial place, heaped earth atop him, tamped it down with satisfying whumps. I was feeling good about myself, heroic, as if, miraculously, compassion and charity had invaded not only my bones, but my soft muscle tissues. I fixed myself a tall glass of gin and tonic and watched the first quarter of the USC football game. And then pangs of conscience assailed me. Hadn't my investigation of said demise of Precious been rather cursory? Wouldn't I myself closely cross-examine a suspect whose emotions were clouded, whose nefarious wishes were well established, whose veterinary skills were without credential? The innocence of my childhood had been spoiled by the tales of Edgar Allan Poe, so it was not difficult to conjure images of Scruffy clawing through tarpaulin and earth as he fought for one last gasp of air that others could more profitably use. I trudged out to the garden with aforementioned spade, and with great lumbar strain exhumed our darling lapdog. Considering the circumstances, he seemed none the worse for wear, but I did detect a marked disinclination to respirate, which I took as a sign either of his inveterate stubbornness or of his having reached the Stygian shore. The latter seemed more likely. I heard in my fuddled head a line from The Wild Bunch, when a critically injured gunman begs his outlaw gang to finish it. And in the healing spirit of Hippocrates, I lifted high the shovel and winged it down on Harvey's head. To my relief, not a whimper issued from him. I was confident he was defunct. With care, I shrouded and buried him again, committing earth to earth and dust to dust and so on. And with sprite-like step, conveyed myself to the kitchen, where I made another gin and tonic and, in semi-prone position, settled into the game's third quarter, the fabled Trojan running attack, grinding out, it would seem, another win. I was shocked awake by the impertinence of a ringing telephone, which I, with due caution, answered. It was my wife's friend, Vicky, inquiring about the pooch. For it was her assertion that Snip had fancied a taste of her son's upper calf, and without invitation or permission to do so, had partaken of same within the last 24 hours. Even while I was wondering what toxicity lurked in the child's leg, and to what extent the poison was culpably responsible for our adored pet's actionable extinction, a loss we would feel for our lifetimes, Vicky insisted that I have the dog checked out by a vet to ascertain if he had rabies. Cause of death, rabies. It seemed unlikely. Notwithstanding his surliness, there had been no Cujo-esque frothing or lunging at car windows. But my familiarity with totes has made me both careful and rather unctuous with a plaintiff, and so I assured my wife's friend that I would accede to her request. Off to the backyard again, my pace that of a woebegone trudge, and with aforementioned implement of agriculture, I displaced the slack and loosened earth. This was getting old. With an accusatory tone, I said, "You're doing this on purpose, aren't you?" And I took his silence as a plea of nolo contendere. My plan, of course, was to employ the Oldsmobile 88 to transport my burden to the canine's autopsy at Dr. Romo's office just a half-mile away. However, upon my settling into its plush front seat, it came to my attention that Zach, he was but a sojourner on this earth, had not thought to replenish the fuel he'd used up on his trip to the old Hollywood Bowl last night. The vehicle was not in a condition of plenitude, would not ferry us farther than a block. With Buster lying in the altogether on the driveway, not yet unsightly but no calendar page, I went into the house and found an old leather suitcase in the attic, then stuffed the mutt into the larger flap compartment before hefting shortcake on his final journey to those veterinary rooms he always shivered in. I am, as I might have implied, a man of depth, perspicacity, and near Olympian strength. But I found myself hauling my heavy and lifeless cargo to Dr. Romo's with a pronounced lack of vigor and resolve. The September afternoon was hot. The Pasadena streets were vacant. The entire world seemed to have found entertainment and surcease in ways that I had not. I was, in a word, in a sweaty snit. And after many panting and pain-filled stops, my spine in Quasimodo configuration, and my right arm gradually inching longer than my left, it was all I could do not to heave the suitcase containing Wonder Dog into a hallway behind the Chinese restaurant. But during our joint ordeal, I had developed a grudging affection for our pet. He who had been so quick to defend my kith and kin against the noise of passing trucks, who took loud notice of the squirrels outside, who held fast in the foyer, hackles raised, fearlessly barking whenever company arrived at the front door. With him, I seemed calm, masterful, and uneccentric, the superior man that the I Ching talks so much about. Without him, I thought I might be otherwise. I put down the suitcase to shake the ache from my fingers and subtract affliction from my back. And it was then that my final indignity came. An angel of mercy spied my plight, braked his ancient Cadillac, and got out, his facial piercings and tattoos and shoot the marble's eyes, belying the kindness and decency of his heart as he asked, "Can I help you with that suitcase?" "I can handle it." "Are you sure?" "I'm just 2 blocks away." "What the heck's in it?" he asked. And for some reason I said, "A family heirloom." "Wow," he said. "Why don't you put it in my trunk and I'll help you with it? I got nothing better to do." Well, I did not just fall off the turnip truck. I would have been, in other circumstances, suspicious. But I was all too aware of the weight and worthlessness of my encumbrance, and so I granted his specified offer, hoisting the deceased into the Seville and slamming down the trunk lid. And in evidence of our fallen state, my Samaritan immediately took off without me, jeering and peeling rubber and speeding west toward Los Angeles. I could only lift my hand in a languid wave. "So long, old sport." Our world being the location of penance and recrimination, it was only right that my last kid should pedal up to me on her bike just then and ask, "Daddy, what are you doing here?" Waving to a fella in need of a shovel, I thought. And then I confessed Sparky's sudden death, the burial, not the exhumation and execution attempt, but the imputation of rabies and my arduous efforts to acquit his reputation with a pilgrimage to the vets. Susie took it all in with sang-froid for a little while, but then the lip quivered and tears spilled from her gorgeous eyes. And as I held her close, she begged me to get her another dog just like Sparky. And that was Sparky's final revenge, for I said, "Okay, honey, another dog just like him." Thank you very much.